So I'm always advocating you need to know your numbers. You cannot solve a problem. You can't quantify a problem. You can't come up with a plan unless you actually know what the numbers are.
Some of the struggles with not just entrepreneurs, but people in general is about cash flow. Like what you mentioned, when they get paid, it already has a label on it, house rent, taxes, groceries, etc. Now, what are some of the most common cash flow problems that entrepreneurs need to avoid and or that the ordinary people who are employees would that that they need to avoid as well?
So I'm going to go back one step just to say some of the common missteps I see, kind of finance overall, and then get into cash flow. So the first thing I see, especially with entrepreneurs, but it certainly is prevalent on the personal side too, is just thinking, I don't need to worry about that. That's not my forte. I'm just going to ignore those numbers. And I'm going to make money and it's going to work out. So that's one thing. The second is I'm going to delegate it to somebody and then I don't need to look at it. So on the entrepreneur side, people are just saying, okay, bookkeeper, accountant, you handle that. I'm handling everything else in my business. Personally, somebody might get a financial planner and then just say, okay, that's it. So those are the two big ones, because a lot of people have blocks around money and think that it's really hard and complicated. So if you've grown up thinking you weren't good at math, then that's probably going to be the case. So really, I advocate for people to be accountable and knowledgeable about their numbers. It does not mean doing it alone. You certainly employ professionals to help you, but at the end of the day, you've got to be in charge of your life financially. So from a cash flow perspective, what is quite common, particularly on the entrepreneur side, is that there's a little bit of a disconnect between that P&L that we were talking about, the sales, and then the cash flow cycle. So depending on the business, so let's think about an event planning kind of business. We're going to have a wedding. If I'm the event planner, I'm going to charge you a 50% deposit typically before the event, and then you're going to pay me before I even execute on your wedding day. Versus other people may collect in full before they start delivering their products or services. Or another type, which is most common and creates the most cash flow challenges, is, Sean, you can take my products home today and I'm going to send you an invoice and then you pay me later. And so that later could be 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. So all of a sudden we've recorded these sales, but then the cash doesn't come for this time way later. And so we've got this disconnect. So when we're thinking about cash flow, we absolutely need to think about what is the cycle of it? When does the money actually come? And then does it correlate to when the money goes out? And I know that from most business owners I work with, they're not making a profit. So there's generally not enough cash to cover all of the expenses that need to be there. And as you raised earlier, they're not getting paid consistently, which is an issue for them. They're not living up to the obligations of their family. And it's certainly not why they went into business. People go into business to make money, and sometimes they think that it's not going to be as much work as having a job. But that trade-off is you have to work a lot, but you also don't necessarily get that steady paycheck that employment brings. So my best advice is start to understand that cash flow cycle. And when you actually start looking at the numbers regularly, you do see that there is a pattern. And your business is going to be potentially different than someone else's. So you can't just start comparing yourself to somebody else. You've really got to look at the timing and how things work with yours. And then when you put it together, this much comes in, this much goes out. Usually there's going to be a hole at the bottom. The earlier you know that you're going to have that shortfall, the more options you can brainstorm to solve the problem. Can you get a loan at the bank? Maybe you can call some of those customers who didn't pay you for a long time and ask them to pay you. Maybe you can put in some money you have personally. All kinds of options can be brainstormed ahead of a problem. But if you're not knowing that it's going to come, all of a sudden it's the day you got to make payroll and you don't have the funds to do it.
That sucks if that happens. So, I'm the type of guy who always tells myself that cash is king. And early on in my business, I've had this incident where there are only During that time, three big television stations here in the country, in the Philippines, and one of them became my client, and I was doing SEO for them. Now, my contact there have been repeatedly telling me that we pay late, we pay late. Sure, okay, I understand, but I didn't really understand that they're going to be paying like 10 months after the contract elapsed
Wow.
late. That's how late they paid. And so they almost put me out of business because they were a very big client. I had to allocate a good number of my manpower to them, but they paid me super late while my other clients were paying me prepaid, which is very good for my cash flow,
Hmm.
but they're getting served, just normally while this client is getting served with a premium service. So that was a big lesson for me right there. And I had to get down on my knees and pray and a miracle happened soon not soon after I prayed, the client came in and they paid me a very big check, prepaid, just 2 weeks from that incident. So I was able to make payroll, but I was already thinking about the things that you were mentioning
Yeah.
earlier. I was thinking about loaning from the bank. Should I borrow from family and friends, which I've never done during that time. I was a 3-year-old entrepreneur just like you, but I had no real experience with getting employed. I worked in Hewlett Packard for 5 months, and that's it. That's my entire resume. So, yeah, I was at a tough spot. It sucks to have cash flow problems. Really, really sucks, especially if you're an entrepreneur, and especially if people are relying on you for their livelihood because you have to make payroll. So,
Absolutely. And from my time in banking, I know that a company can go out of business in as quick as 90 days. Like that's as short as it
that's
can take.
fast.
Because if you're just looking at your P&L, your profit and loss, your income statement, and you see you've got all these sales booked and they're higher than your expenses, you're thinking, great, I'm profitable. You can be highly profitable on paper, but if you get a couple clients just like the one you mentioned, Sean, you don't have any money to keep things going. And
Right.
so having cash reserves, if you can, having access to financing is really key. And certainly COVID has really brought this back into the forefront. If we think about it on the personal side, like typically we would advise individuals to have an emergency fund that's like 3 to 6 months your expenses. Now people are recommending, given the uncertainty of what can happen, like you should be building up a 9 to 12 months emergency fund.
Right.
So we're exponentially growing what those cash reserves should be. So
Hmm.
it's stressful. It is something every entrepreneur goes through. One thing I'd like to add though, because I was mentioning that when I start working with my clients, they tell me they don't know anything about money or they don't know anything about their financial results. And I will ask them, well, how long have you been in business? And they may say 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is. And so I tell them, if you've been in business for anything longer than 90 days or 5 or 6 months, you actually know how to manage cash flow.
Hmm.
You may not
Yeah.
do it efficiently. You may not do it well. You may not talk about it the way that I do or think about it the way that I do. But the mere fact that you are still in business means you know how to do it. So for anybody who's listening right now, who's been around for a little while, give yourself a pat on the back because you do know how to manage cash flow. And that cash is the lifeblood of any business. So without it, you're in big trouble.
Right. That's true. Super. And I'm wondering, and I'm just curious about it, because I do agree with the emergency fund, and in business we call it safety net. How many of your clients have actually had a 6 months or more in terms of their safety net and or emergency fund?
It's a smaller percentage, probably 10 to 15% at most, because when
Wow.
you're starting out, you're very, very lean. There's a lot of expenses related with startup, depending. Certainly, if you have a product based business, there's going to be a lot more heavy
Hmm.
outlay of cash at the beginning. So it's being disciplined around as you make profit. There has to be reinvestment in the business, but then there also needs to be money put aside for those rainy days, for those emergencies. If all of a sudden things stop, how are you going to keep paying your bills? So it is a smaller percentage. And I would say that those who hit over the 3, 4, 5 year mark, if they're profitable, then that starts to change more at that point.
Hmm. Hmm. That is a dismal figure, 10 to 15%. But it does make sense. It's when you're starting up, risk
Mhm.
is super high. No.
Yeah, and usually entrepreneurs are bootstrapping. They're just leveraging whatever they can to get to be able to get that next sale, to be able to pay that employee, do
Yeah.
whatever they need to do, and that's perfectly normal. So anybody who's thinking, "Oh, that's me. I'm in that 85% boat," you're not abnormal. That is kind of the cycle of business.
Yeah. So what would be the one big advice that you can give entrepreneurs who have problems with cash flow? What is one, if you could
So
tell them one thing, what would it be?
So I'm always advocating you need to know your numbers. You cannot solve a problem. You can't quantify a problem. You can't come up with a plan unless you actually know what the numbers are. So I highly suggest that all entrepreneurs have regular money meetings with themselves. If they have a business partner, maybe with a key person of their staff, maybe it's their bookkeeper, minimum monthly. But I think if you're just starting to get to know your numbers, it should be a weekly practice. Make it a routine. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. Start asking questions. At the beginning, it's hard to even know what questions to ask, but maybe the first time you're just looking at your bank accounts, seeing what's going on in there. Maybe you start to look at that P&L and you just study it for a bit, and then the next time you're going to come up with some questions. But know those numbers. Oftentimes the reality is not as bad as people imagine it in their head, and you can't actually move forward to getting any problem solving ideas going if you don't know the actual extent of the problem. I find that people can move through quickly and actually start to solve the issues once they can quantify it and know it. But if you're still just afraid and kind of hiding out away from the numbers, it just keeps going, and it's very, very stressful. It's like you were talking about when not making payroll, whether it's individuals or entrepreneurs, it's like this huge weight is sitting on your shoulders, and I can actually see it visibly kind of lift off of people once they start to understand and they're in then the action of how do I fix this.
Hmm. And it's strange for me why people, especially entrepreneurs, would see their cash flow or their balance sheet or their numbers that way. Because when you start a business, money is a big part of it, right? I mean, it is in fact one of the things that excited me about my business when I was starting out. What's the reason behind that? Why are they either afraid, or why do they want to just delegate it and offload it from themselves?
So there's a couple different reasons. Certainly in Canada, and you can comment on this later, Sean, if it's the case, but certainly in Canada, the school system does a really poor job educating students about money, whether it be on the personal side or the entrepreneurial side. So you come out of high school and you don't know that much about money. The education system will say, okay, parents, you should educate your children. Well, most of them were not educated about it, so they're not in a position to do that. So it's kind of this vicious cycle. The second thing that I think really contributes to it is that entrepreneurs start businesses that they're passionate about, that they have a skill, and most of it is not about money. So if I'm a graphic designer, I was never given any formal training about running a business. So I mean, I certainly can relate it to my own experience when I was a lender and in risk management at TD Bank, one of Canada's big 5 banks. I was an expert at 3 or 4 things. When I started my business, all of a sudden I'm wearing 30, 40 hats. I don't know how to create a website. I don't know how to use social media, and I have to learn. And finance is one of those areas that you've got to learn. And it is so important, but it can be daunting if you never thought you were good at it, you don't have any training, and you're not sure where to go. So my best advice is to talk to people you know and trust, ask them how they get comfortable, and ask them if they can refer you to somebody that can help you. The other thing that's super important on an individual or entrepreneur side is there's so many people out there who can help you, but don't work with someone who doesn't make you feel comfortable. If you feel inadequate or you don't feel very smart when you're talking to them, that's not the right person. Somebody should empower you and teach you things in a way that you understand, and there's no silly or stupid questions. So find the right fit so that you can then start building up your knowledge, and just take it one day at a time. And it's building block concepts. You can't learn everything in one day. So start, build the foundation, and then learn on it, grow on it.
Fantastic. And it's the same here in the Philippines. They don't teach you about finances. They don't teach you about cash flow, or they don't teach you about personal finance management either. So you would have to pretty much learn it on your own, maybe in a
Mm-hmm.
seminar or two, We do have really good seminars here about it, but it's just that people don't see the value of it, so they also do not attend, and it's a saddening thing. So even if we are, half the world away, it's pretty much the same thing from here and there.